First of all, I want to say thanks to everyone here, and thanks to Nikhil and Justin and AJ for hosting this. So maybe just give a round of applause to organizers. So yeah, thanks for being here. My name is Adam Lesnikowski, and I'm a machine learning scientist, former senior software engineer for perception at Nvidia, and happy to present today and talk to you about some of the work we're doing on creating data sets in a data-driven way. So the talk of this title is Data-Driven Dataset Creation, Deep Active Learning for Autonomous Vehicles and Beyond. Cool, and maybe just by show of hands, so who here has heard of active learning? Heard of active learning? And who maybe has used it in one of their projects? Okay, so not too many people. So maybe after this talk, I'll inspire you to explore some of these techniques. So kind of one of the, oh, let me also ask you, so who here is at the undergraduate level? Who here is a master's student? Who here is PhD? And who here is postdoc or faculty? Okay, cool. So I'll try to target the talk and content towards those kind of rough buckets. Cool, so what's the motivation? So why are we doing what we're doing, and why are we going through this? Well, I think first, there's kind of, you probably heard three big pillars in machine learning nowadays. So there's computation, which is essential. There's model architectures, which there's a lot of great work in academia. But there's also data, and kind of the naive approach is just to throw all the data at the problem that you can and kind of hope for the best. And that's worked and really paid a lot of dividends. But we actually think that there's a much better way to do this. And in particular, some of the motivations from, say, biology or neurobiology, we kind of just aren't presented with a random sequence of things. Like, we kind of learn, and like we can learn from actually a limited amount of data, but we do it in a way that we're actually controlling. There's some nice neurobiology experiments that if you withhold that control from, say, lab animals, they don't learn in a normal way. So if they can't control what they're seeing, then they don't learn in a normal way. So we're hoping to leverage those kind of motivations and experiments and be able to have information from the model tell us essentially what to label next. Okay, and kind of the two big motivations for us and Nvidia are, so we have cars, so we have an AV program, and sensors, and they give lots of data. So lots and lots of data, so petabytes of data. And we also have, so we also know from the literature, and we believe that if we have enough labeled data, so on the lower left, together with state-of-the-art methods, convolutional neural networks and LSTMs and all that, we can basically have autonomous vehicles. So we can play whatever we want and just chill out and read while we're driving. And the big question for us is, how do we go from the upper right, which is lots of data, to the lower left, which is labeled data, in the most efficient and most cost-effective and most time-efficient way? So how do we go from the left to the right? And we could do that by simply brute forcing, by uniform sampling. But we actually have a lot of results. So Lorenz mentioned in the previous talk that it's been a very interesting empirical observation that the performance of a lot of models across many domains, it goes as the log of the data set size. But we know that cost goes as what the linear part of linear with respect to data set size. So we have a mismatch that if we want linear performance gains, we're going to have an exponential blow up in terms of cost. So we don't want that. So we actually think that there's better ways to do that in terms of labeling efficiency. So basically, time and money is the official answer, and we think we can reduce both of those through our approaches. And then the other point is that not all data are created equally. So on the one hand, we have things on the left, which are boring highway images. On the other, we have sort of anomalous images. And for safe autonomous vehicles, how do we find those things on the right in unlabeled data? And how do we upsample those for labeling? And we really want to get those right, because these are the multitude of interesting corner cases which are probably going to break our system and cause a lot of loss and potentially not just property, but also loss in terms of injury and death. So we want to really avoid that, both for ourselves and, I guess, this guy's sake. So there's some short segments that we really care about, and we want to find those. And we think that some samples are going to have much more information, so we want to upsample those informative samples. So here's our two motivating challenge. So one, how do we find the most informative unlabeled images so we can get the safest AV? And then how do we improve the sample complexity of training? Okay, so here's the approach that we think is going to work, and we're scaling this up rapidly. So the traditional machine learning approach is that we have some model and some train set that's given to us, so think like ImageNet or something else, and we just optimize the heck out of our models given that train set. And that's great. There's a lot of useful and interesting work done there. But in many cases, we can actually infinitely sample from some training distribution. And in particular, we can collect a lot of unlabeled data. And based on how our model is doing, we can upsample some of those or downsample others or just completely ignore others. And so we're really in a luxurious position within industry that we have the budget and we have the label and we have the capability, the car fleets, to be able to collect all this unlabeled data and then choose what gets labeled. And kind of our hypothesis is that much of the information is actually collected in a really small subset of the unlabeled data. And this is kind of borne out by some of the experiments that we've run. I'll show later. So in this setup, we use the model. We query the unlabeled data, upsample things that we think are going to have higher expected information, send that to labeling, and then append our train set. And this whole thing is called the active learning approach, or if you want to be specific, the pool-based active learning approach. And there's some other things that we've done where instead of unlabeled data, we have maybe generators or we have other approaches, but this is kind of the high-level heuristic to keep in mind. So in terms of data sets, you guys are probably familiar with this, so I'll skip on the details, but for classification, we used both MNIST and ImageNet. For lane segmentation, so for a semantic segmentation challenge, we used an in-house data set with 100K images in the train set and 10K images in the test set. And so here's a few examples of those. Actually, I noticed that maybe some of the bottom is cut out. I don't know if there's any way to fix that. Okay, so just I'll try to do a VQA on the bottom if there's any ambiguity. And for object detection, there's a similarly sized 150K train, 10K test split. And for object detection, the goal is to return bounding boxes around objects that you care about. So in this case, cars, pedestrians, motorcycles, et cetera. So how do we do? So for segmentation, so maybe I'll stop at this point and say, are there any questions on the setup, or are things kind of clear? Okay, so if they are, I'll just keep on going. Yeah, question?
Is it both shape and color of the car?
Excuse me?
Does the algorithm use both shape and color of the car to understand how many cars there are on that row?
So I would say what the algorithm uses is a quite big open question, modern machine learning, since these methods use things like deep convolutional neural networks. Being able to interpret them is, it's not really quite clear what they use. As best as we can tell, they use a hierarchy of low-level features like colors and textures, together with mid and high-level features like arrangements of those and even semantic concepts to be able to do the prediction. So it's an interesting question with a lot of details, but that's what I can say about it.
So are you just doing looking at data sets with just images, or are you looking at like LiDAR and stuff as well?
So far it's just images. So we have LiDAR and radar data, but we haven't done anything with that yet. So what do the results look like? So for segmentation, on the right is if we train a segmentation model on all the data set, and the left is what's called F-score. So this is a kind of mean between recall and precision, but just think of it a number you want to try to optimize. And we're trying to get so higher is better, lower is worse. And with all the data on the right, we get about 0.76. And on the left, what the setup is that we train initially with just 30% of the data, and then do just one active learning loop, so one sampling using information from the model to sample things and then have those labeled on 30 additional percent of the data. So it's 30% plus 30%. So how do we do? So that's pretty great. We get about, say, 2.5 points of difference, which is really pretty significant compared to some of the architectural things that we tried previously and other approaches. And I would stress that this is all data-driven, so the selection methods are purely driven from the model, information that the model does on unlabeled data. So that's really quite nice. So you might want to ask, how robust are these results? So we did the same setup, but we did it 10 times. And these are box plots. And just to remind you guys what box plots are. The green line is the median. The box is the 25 and 75 percentiles. And then the fences are some function of that distance around the 25 and 75 percentiles. And then the circles are outliers. So that's things which are usually within past 1.5 times the interquartile distance past the fences. So it's a really nice kind of one-dimensional summary of a data set. Question?
In the lane analysis,
Yeah.
is using both images of empty rows and images of full rows?
Both, yeah. So we have both, and I guess it's an interesting question whether the model upsamples or downsamples those, and I can get to some of those questions. But it's really just what the cars are collecting, kind of the natural distribution on roads. Okay, so there's the active learning results, which is really quite nice. So the results bear out. So again, we see, and this time actually it's a little bit bigger. It's about 3-point difference. And so that was really, really great to see. And just to give you some intuition as to what's going on, so here's some of our labels, or some of the labels I think are on the bottom. No, sorry. These are all predictions. And just to give you an idea of what the metric is that we use. So you could ask, like, what information from the model do we use in order to select these images? Well, for this one, it's actually pretty easy. And this is actually a baseline that we wanted to test, which was the average entropy across all pixels for prediction. And so just to give you an idea what that looks like, so on the upper right are low entropy images. So the predictions are low entropy in that there's a lot of both yellow and blues. So these indicate both high confidences or low confidences by the model in it being a lane. And on the left, upper left, are high entropy images. So there's a lot more shades of blue and green to indicate confidences closer to 0.5. Okay, so that really worked pretty well. In terms of detection, so the experiment setup is very similar, except with detection data. So the idea is you want to draw these bounding boxes around cars. And I want to actually, this was joint work. So the last one I worked on last year, and this result was joint with Tim, who's here in the audience. So he was an intern last summer, and he could tell you all about the company and what it was like working there for a summer. So we had some nice results on some of the object detection work. So the setup is the same. So blue is the baseline. So blue is the performance we get using just 10K images. Purple is also the base with fine-tuning on 10K more images, but 10K is just selected randomly. So it's kind of an A/B test setup. So the A arm of the test setup is that we just append 10K random images, and the B arm is that we append 10K images which are selected in an active way. And we do really quite better. So this is MAP across all categories, so mean average precision. And we had a really nice difference between the baseline and the active learning setup. And I would want to stress that this is using just the same amount of data. So we get that performance gain using just the same amount of data. So how do we do on persons? So persons are actually a pretty hard category for us, and it's pretty important also. If you think about pedestrians, they're generally a lot smaller than cars, and we want to be able to really do well on those because it's safety critical. So the blue again is the model trained with 10K. Purple is the model appended with 10K random, and then orange is the model where we did 10K in an active setup. Okay, so we really did quite a lot, so almost doubled the performance on the baseline model, which is great. So this is exactly what we wanted to see. Yeah, question?
Can ellipses sometimes be better than rectangles?
Ellipses for?
Ellipses instead of those rectangles.
Yeah, so internally in the model, we have some versions of the model that use ellipses. There's actually, I think bounding boxes are basically what the community uses because it was easy to do, it was easy to label. You really want probably like a semantic segmentation map where each pixel is labeled as a car or not car. But just in terms of what computer vision researchers usually do is bounding boxes. But we also explored with some semantic segmentation techniques. So just to give you an example of how these things look like and what's going on. So as a sanity check, we also did, so what if you take all the unlabeled examples and then you sorted by this, this confusion metric, which is, you could think of it roughly as disagreement between multiple copies of the same model, but trained with some different random seeds. So two models, it's an ensemble technique. You train them on the same data set. The level of disagreement is going to indicate how confused the model is given that data set, or more particularly, how confused the ensemble of models is on a test point. Okay, so here's the least confused image, which is really quite nice. It's almost the same prediction, so that's a nice sanity check. And it's also kind of a scene that we expect, so a scene that we see a lot in the data set, highway scene. And here's one with a pretty high confusion. So the high confusion, that's like everything that we have in autonomous vehicles in terms of difficulty. So we have a lot of pedestrians in a night scene with like a truck in the back. So it was actually awesome to see that the method was able to pick this out from an large unlabeled test pool using just information from the model. And so we think that this is part of the reason why the active learning approaches are doing much better is that they're upsampling more informative images. And so this picture, like if you take everything that's hard in autonomous vehicles and like crank it up to 11, that's kind of what you would get. Cool, so maybe I'll stop and see if there's any questions at this point.
People thought of using drones over major highways.
Yes, they have. They have. We haven't. We haven't used them, but there's a lot of people who have. Yeah, maybe maybe you can talk to some of the other people here. Yeah.
While upsampling the images, do you do any extra operations, like do you crop it or like?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
When you're upsampling the high confusion images, do you do any extra operations, or is it the same image, or is it any different?
So it depends on the experiment. You can do both. So the question is, when we upsample images, do we say crop it maybe at high confused parts of the image, or do we just do the whole image? So for this set of experiments, we just did the whole image. For some of the other experiments, especially for semantic segmentation, since it's quite hard to label that, we gave actually just crops of the image to labelers. So we basically break it up, the image up into smaller patches, and then have that patch labeled. So really, it's a judgment call in terms of how difficult things are to label. So I imagine for like something like CT scans or medical images where the cost of labeling is just super high, like think like thousands of dollars per an image, then you really probably want to make the most out of those radiologist times. Whereas for this, bounding boxes, it's really pretty easy to label a whole image, so we just went with that. Good question. So here's just a kind of lightning round of classification results. And the idea here is to motivate some of the themes that we've seen and to really, really experiment in some of the themes of active learning in like a really clean setting. So the classification results, so here's, so the green is basically the baseline. The blue is appending random data. And so we see some gain in data, and the x-axis is epochs, the y-axis is accuracy. And so the green basically peters out at some performance at epoch 200, which is the middle of the image, kind of there. We add more data, and we get some better performance, and that's a function of just adding more data, which is great. So now what happens if we add more data but in an active way, so things that are most highly confusing for the model? So that's really quite nice. So we get a lot more performance gain given the same labeling budget. So can we do this multiple times? So what if we do multiple active learning cycles? So that's great. It actually keeps working. So we had some more experiments where we say, all right, what if we just do it, say, 10 times or 6 times or 8 times? So a bunch of times, kind of what's the long-term behavior? So it's really quite nice. So we notice that at every epoch that's 200 times n, essentially, so each of those ticks at the bottom, we get some performance gain. And that performance gain is starting to peter out. And if you actually do this model with all the data, you'll get an asymptote at around 0.99. And that's kind of where the green line is heading towards. And you can actually do an analysis where you can get almost to the same point as all the data set on this particular data set with something like 20% of the images. So you can define even the active learning efficiency, which is the ratio of the data that you need in an active way that you can recover the same performance. So there's kind of this classical machine learning problem, which is called core set selection. And the idea is that you have this whole big data set, and after the fact, you want to select the things that were the most informative and just throw away everything else. So the smallest set of things that recovers the full train set performance. Okay, so we had some experiments where we modify the growth factor. So what if we add, say, 10% or 33% or 100% of the data every time? And the bottom is adding 10%, the middle is adding 33%, and the top is adding, so basically doubling the data set. And this is really quite nice because it really shows the performance is linear in terms of log of the data set size. So the 10, 33%, 100%, those are essentially half orders of magnitude. So we see linear performance gains as the log of the data set size. And that actually keeps going, so that's really nice. And just for comparison, the lighter shade in alpha is what the random policy would do. Okay, so this is a really interesting experiment where we said, what if we take not just the most informative images, but the least informative images? So what happens on all those things that look like the top example in the object detection? So all the things that the model seems pretty sure about. And what if we add those? So the red is going to be that, so the 10%. So whatever the budget is, and we add the most confident images, and we don't get any performance gain there. So that's really nice to see. So we keep doing that, and we can do it over many cycles. And it's really quite nice for us in the sense that a lot of this data, so this stuff on the red, that's all the things that you can just throw away. So all the stuff you don't have to store in your data set, in your data center, all the stuff you don't have to send from your car to your data center, all the stuff you don't have to train on. And it's particularly relevant when you say have simulators, when you have simulated data. You can generate a potentially infinite amount of simulated data, but you can never train on all of that. So you have to select some part of the simulator's output space in order to sample from. And we really think that this is one approach that is going to be able to let you do that effectively. Okay, so maybe let's see. So how are we doing on time here? Cool. So we also did some experiments where, so with these models, the central idea is that one model will give you some uncertainty metric. And there's also some other approaches where it's called an ensemble approach. The idea is you train n models and then measure disagreement between that ensemble. And we did a bunch of results that show that we get pretty comparable performance between the two. So in this case, in this setup, the model does multiple passes over the unlabeled data set size, unlabeled data. And we found, so the red and green are basically a lot of this experiments from the previous slides, but with this new approach. And this approach, if you're interested in the literature, it's called the Bayesian test time dropout approach. So it's one model, but you apply different dropout masks at test time, and you can do multiple predictions from that. And you can think of a neural network as an ensemble of models, and if you apply different dropout masks, you're subsampling from that ensemble. And the idea is that the network itself is an ensemble, but you subsample from the ensemble, and you can get a measure of the ensemble confusion from a single network. And we actually found, so there's some past literature that perhaps it's just better or worse, and we found in our experiments that it does essentially the same. And and as you sample more, you get better and better estimates of what we got before. We also have some scalability results. So we did this on ImageNet, so about 1 million images, and a lot of the same results held as well. So I think this shows that we're pretty comfortable that on large data sets we can get similar performance. Okay, so in conclusion, I would say deep active learning is effective in our experience. Our methods have led to pretty significant efficiency gains, and it's really able to find kind of interesting and hard examples from unlabeled data in a way that was kind of surprising to us, but it validated a lot of our initial hypotheses that this is one way to deal with our two motivating problems. Cool. So I want to thank these people who worked over this past summer and the summer before. Tim's there, and some of the other people who worked this past summer. So Jamming, Yusuf, Kashyap, Jose, one of my colleagues, Aisha on the bottom, Tim, Evan, Clement, and Shalina and Steven, some projects that we're currently working on. So I also want to say you guys should apply. So we're in California. We also have, so we're in Santa Clara, Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of great opportunities, I think, there. So you can apply for research, applied research, ML, DL, computer vision, software, hardware engineering, architecture, and other roles. And you can follow up with the university recruiting team, so Serena, Cynthia, or myself. And you can catch me on email or Twitter. So we're looking basically for students and grad students and postdocs to help us basically design, run, and validate these experiments. And I should also say that we have a new AI research residency program. So like a lot of the other companies, we have a program. So it's 12 months, and it's officially tailored towards PhD students or finished PhDs. But I would encourage you to apply. You never know what happens with these things. I've always applied to things thinking that maybe I wasn't qualified to do them, but still some of those worked out. So it's a one-year program, and you can be paired with a researcher at Nvidia, and the goal is to do research and publish papers and to learn from the great people there. And so yeah, come to sunny California. I actually went to school down the river, did math at Harvard, and I remember this weather. And so if you're looking for something different, then come to California. So questions, answers, discussions, and I have some videos. Some cars driving backwards and propeller cars. Yeah, you?
So how do you deal with mistakes in the high confusion images you showed us? You just feed it more data?
So that's a good question. So the question was, how do you deal with mistakes in high confusion images? I guess, is it mistakes in the sense of, well, there's one sort of mistake where the model is not really trained that well. You can't really take its predictions that seriously. And so this is a problem. And our approach has been that in that case, it basically decomposes or it reverts back to a random sampling strategy. So the efficiency gains from a random sampling strategy start to take over. And then as you add more data, the model gets better and starts to have a better estimate of its own uncertainty. So that's the way we think about it. So this kind of cold start problem that, like, how do you start this active learning cycle where you don't have very good uncertainty estimates if you're relying on uncertainty estimates? And our solution was, well, the effect of just adding more data is going to overcome that problem. And we found that it does. Yeah, question?
So you mentioned you're doing this only on images. Is there
Yes.
a way to sort of apply this to maybe lighter data or something? 'Cause I know like a lot of it may be harder to label, or maybe you can't label at all. Maybe some of it's still more important than others.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of these techniques translate pretty cleanly over to other kinds of data sets. So in the particular case of LiDAR, which is, say, a point cloud in three-dimensional space. So the multiple models technique, which is an ensemble, the setup there is essentially train n models, in the easiest case, 2 models. Okay. And then with different random Cs, or with some, maybe even just different order of presentation of the data, and then measure things where they disagree with the most, and upsample those for labeling. And this isn't just for like that kind of spatial data. You could do it for NLP as well. So take your NLP model. It has some naive confidence outputs. You could do an entropy if it's probabilistic, or you can do a disagreement between a committee. In the back.
So I think like you calculate the entropy at every 200 steps, right? So every 200 steps.
Yeah.
So like what changes if you do it at a shorter period or longer?
So that's a good question. We experimented with this. We went down to 100, 50, even shorter ones. And kind of the limit is like you do it maybe at every one, right? Every epoch, you just upsample a small amount of your budget. You upsample some of the things that you want to label those, and then retrain. So so on that limit, there's one downside, which is in terms of neural networks, in terms of statistical significance, there's really little that they get from individual images. So we kind of batch the amount of stuff that we label. You could do it at, say, 50, and you still get the similar results. There's still for our networks, at 50 epochs, there was still performance gain just from the model continuing to optimize on a data set. So we wanted to separate, like, all right, it's done optimizing on that data set. What's the efficiency gain just by virtue of the new data? So that's why we did it probably slightly longer than you would in practice. But you're absolutely right. You could shorten that if you want. And for us, actually, at Nvidia, we're really not GPU bounded. Like, we have essentially infinite GPUs we can train on. So for us, it's like not a huge deal to just let it train longer. For us, the cost is higher. So yeah, I think I saw a question.
Well, in contrast to labeled data and unlabeled data, could there be semi-labeled data, which maybe is better for color and not the semi-labeled data for shape? In other words, could there be an intermediate state which you speed up the process, do a sample from that part of the data that would deal with the uncertainty that's been obtained?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the question was, or the point was, maybe you could have, say, semi-labeled data and then maybe do some clever strategy there. So there's a few things I could say about that. One is that the labeling that's currently done, you could actually decompose into a hierarchy where, for instance, maybe one labeler says, all right, there's like no cars here, and that goes into one part of the decision tree. And then maybe each individual person labels an individual car. And so at every kind of node in that tree of the labeling tree, you could sample uncertainty and then upsample things which are more uncertain. So you'd have basically partially labeled images at every node in that tree, and then just do what we did here on every node of those. And that's actually, there's some good research too in kind of human-computer interaction that breaking it up into like these very discrete binary tasks actually improves efficiency on the aggregate. So whereas the traditional approach is you have a person sit down an image and spend a minute or 10 minutes labeling this stuff, you really just want to kind of like break it up into atomic tasks and then send it off to like however many people you have. So that's an interesting point. And we also did some experiments, right, which I haven't had here because we haven't really said too much about them or published them, where for the semantic segmentation, we actually just did patches of things in terms of patches of the image that we sample confusion on and then send to labeling, or we don't send to labeling. So that's another example of a partially labeled image. Tim.
I have a question. Are the high confusion images the ones that we end up deciding are like the models I'm confused about? Do they end up being very model specific? Like if you had, say, two separate architectures trained on the same data set, and they then get to you measure their confusion on, I guess, this unlabeled data set. Do they share which images they have high confusion on, or?
It's an interesting question. So the question Tim asked was, how stable, essentially, are the images selected as the top or least confused according to different architectures or maybe even different random seeds? And the question is, we don't know. I haven't run that experiment. But I would guess maybe if you were to, this is just wildly speculating, is that if you do with different random seeds of the same architecture, you'll probably get things similar. So maybe there's some stochastic noise where it's not really the top one, but it's in the top 10 or maybe top 100. If you do it with different architectures, I don't know, didn't run that experiment. So that's why you guys should come and help us do this stuff. So California, weather, boba tea, ice cream.
How well does the model deal with reflective surfaces? So they won't distinguish objects in reflection and what's actually there.
So that we didn't look at specifically. So the question was about reflective surfaces. So maybe the one picture that we showed that was most high confusion in the back, you saw the truck, which that's a very reflective surface. So there's some evidence that it's picking up on these kind of difficult characteristics. On the other hand, I would say maybe don't put too much weight in terms of what we find difficult. It might not be the same as what the model finds difficult. And hence the images also that we find informative might not be the same that these networks find informative. So like they're picking up on kind of complex statistical regularities that there's some interesting work that they do in a way that maybe we don't do it as humans. So there's a whole bunch of adversarial examples. There's a whole bunch of things which look very different to us but get trained by the model is the same thing, or things that are imperceptible to us, conversely, things that are imperceptible to us changes but get labeled by the model as different things. So the way we perceive the world and the way that current generations of deep neural networks perceive the world is very different. I would caution that like the things that might be informative for the network might not be informative for us. That being said, at least in these experiments, we did find that, yes, like it validated the hypothesis that the things that we find hard in AV, like just designing these systems by hand and data selection strategies, also show up in the confusion metrics. So hopefully the answer is there somewhere. And then I guess about reflectivity of particular objects, like we didn't really conditionalize or anything. We didn't really try to build too many assumptions into what these models were selecting. Kind of our approach is a data-driven approach that, let the data speak and let the model say what's most confusing. And if that kind of lines up with what we think is confusing, great. If not, then as long as the performance gains are there, that's what we kind of care about the most. Okay, if there's nothing else, thank you for coming here. Thank you for listening. And next up is my colleague Varun. He's going to talk about research on Nvidia.
This room only works with the VGA conversion. Do you have
I think there was.
the USB?
Okay, shall we start? Yep. Hello, everyone. I am Varun Jampani from Nvidia Research. Today, I will present our work on sparse high-dimensional neural networks. So before going into the topic of presentation, I will give a brief overview of Nvidia Research. So we have several academic research teams at Nvidia covering entire stack of AI systems. We have teams working on building circuits and VLSI research and to programming systems and all the way up to machine learning and robotics. So we have over 130 people spanning 11 time zones working at Nvidia Research. So this photo shows the people at Nvidia Research. This photo we took during off-site meeting last year. And the group I am in is called Learning and Perception Research. These are the people in Learning and Perception Research. We have about 20 people in our group now, and in our group we mainly work on a wide range of problems in both computer vision and machine learning. So one of the nice things for being at Nvidia Research is that we can work on the problems of our own interest and while being supported by a company. So if you are interested in doing academic research and want to be in industry, and this is a great place to be at. And so we are actively hiring for interns and full-time positions. So feel free to write emails or talk with the people outside in the booth. So going into the main topic of the presentation, which is sparse high-dimensional neural networks. So spatial convolution is one of the basic building blocks of most CNN architectures, and this is perhaps the simplest, fastest, and most used way of propagating information across image pixels. Right? So how many of you are familiar with CNNs, convolution networks? Okay, yeah, good. So the goal of this work is to equip neural networks with sparse high-dimensional neural networks. So in many computer vision tasks, we have seen neural networks that work on 1D, 2D, or 3D data. So can we generalize these neural networks to work on high-dimensional data such as 4D, 5D, or 6D data? But why do we care about such sparse and high-dimensional data? So one reason is that sometimes we want to project data into higher dimensions because things get more separable in higher dimensions, so it is easier to process data in higher dimensions. And also sometimes the data itself can be inherently sparse and high dimensional. For example, 3D point cloud data or BRDF material properties. So we want to develop neural network architectures for such sparse and high dimensional data. So how do we do that? So before going into our technique, let's first have a closer look into spatial convolution. here spatial convolution is, here I have shown an image which is convolved with a Gaussian filter, and we get a blurred image, right? So we can write spatial convolution like this, that every output feature, Vi tick, can be written as a linear combination of input features, Vj. So this linear combination is defined by the filter weights, W. So the filter weights is parameterized with respect to position differences. So the filter values depends on position differences, Pi minus Pj. So this is the position of the pixels, right? So this is how we can mathematically write a standard spatial convolution. So one of the popular high-dimensional filters is a bilateral filter, which is a generalization of spatial convolution to arbitrary features. So here filter weights, instead of depending on the position differences, they depend on the feature differences. So for example, the feature can be XY RGB. So the filter values depends on the feature differences between the pixels. So we call V as input features and F as lattice features, because we can see this filter as lying in a high-dimensional feature space. Suppose if it is an XY RGB, we can see this as a filter lying on XY RGB space. So the most used kernel for bilateral filtering is this Gaussian kernel, which I have written here, e power minus Fi minus Fj square. So what does it mean that the filter depends on feature differences? So this means that the filter values, bilateral filter depends on the image content itself. So here I have visualized the Gaussian bilateral filter at different locations in an image. As you can see that the filter is not spatially invariant, the filter is spatially variant. So one of the main use cases of Gaussian bilateral filter is that we can smooth the image without smoothing across the edges. So one way to think about this bilateral filtering operation is that as filtering in a high-dimensional feature space, like the feature space of F. If F is XY RGB, we can see it as a 5-dimensional filter, Gaussian filtering there. So let me explain this using a 1D example, this high-dimensional filtering, like how is this usually performed. Let's say we have this 1D signal V, and we want to do the bilateral filtering in the 2-dimensional space, let's say position and intensity. So what we first do is discretize this 2-dimensional space, this lattice space in this 2D space, and then we project the original signal into this 2D space. We call this operation splat onto this 2D space. And then we do the standard Gaussian filtering in this 2D space. And then we actually go back to the original space after this filtering. So we can do the bilateral filtering in the original 1D space by going into high-dimensional feature space and then do standard Gaussian filtering there. So these operations are called splat, going into high-dimensional space, and the standard convolution, Gaussian convolution, and then going back to the original space, we call it slice. So all these operations, splat, convolve, and slice, are linear operations, and they can be written as matrix multiplications. So there is an issue of going into higher dimensions. When we actually discretize the space in higher dimensions, there is an issue with Euclidean lattice. So the issue is that the number of grid corner points increase exponentially with the dimensions. For example, the simplest for 1D is like kind of line segment. We have 2 corner points. The simplest for 2D is a square. We have 4 corner points. And the simplest for 3D is a cube. We have 8 corner points. So the number of corner points increase by 2 power d, so which is exponentially increased with dimensions. So when we discretize a 6-dimensional or 7-dimensional space with Euclidean grid, we have many corner points in each simplex. So when we splat the signal into these corner points, we introduce a lot of artifacts. So people found out that there are better lattice structure that are more suitable for higher dimensional spaces. So one such lattice structure is called permutohedral lattice. So here the main property of this permutohedral lattice is that the number of corner points for a simplex increase linearly with dimension. So for 1D, the simplex is a line segment which has 2 corner points. For 2D, the simplex is a triangle. Here I am showing a 2D permutohedral lattice. And for 3D, the simplex is a kind of a tetrahedron. It's like a pyramid. So the number of corner points increase linearly with the dimension. So when we go to 6D or 7D, so the number of corner points will still be 7 or 8. So then there will be less artifacts when we are projecting the signal to higher dimensions. So in our work, we also make use of this permutohedral lattice for our sparse high-dimensional neural network. Feel free to stop me if there are any questions. Yeah. So the bilateral filtering with permutohedral lattice goes like this. Suppose we want to do bilateral filtering with XY RGB space. First, we discretize the XY RGB space, let's say this 5-dimensional space, using this permutohedral lattice structure. And then we project these input pixels into this 5-dimensional space. And we do standard Gaussian convolution in this 5-dimensional space. We can think of this as a 5D convolution, like let's say 3 by 3 by 3 by 3 by 3 3 convolution, like a 5D convolution. And then once we do this 5D convolution, we project back onto the original input space to get a bilateral filtered image, which is a smooth image, but edge-preserving smooth image. So these are how the lattice looks like if we use different lattice feature spaces. Suppose if we use XY lattice feature spaces, this is how the lattice looks like. Because it is a simple XY space, you can see the triangles. It is a simple permutohedral lattice looks like this. If we use RGB space, the lattice looks like this. So here, what I'm showing here is that the pixels falling in the same simplex are shown with the same color. Because since all the background is blue, so if we use RGB space, in this RGB dimensional space, in this 3D space, all these pixels fall into the same simplex in this 3D space. And this is how the lattice looks like if we go to 5 dimensions XY RGB. So yeah, so this is our core technical contribution of this work. So all the existing works use predefined filters like Gaussian or Laplacian in high-dimensional feature spaces in 5 dimensions or 6 dimensions. So our key observation is that each of these operations, splat, convolve, and slice, are linear operations. So we can actually backprop through them. So we don't need to use some Gaussian filters in high dimensions. We can actually freely parameterize the filters in high-dimensional space, just like in standard neural networks. And we can actually learn these weights via backpropagation. So this is our core technical contribution of this work, to show that we can actually freely parameterize filters in high dimensions and then actually learn them. So yeah, since we can learn the high dimensional filters, we don't need to use a single Gaussian filter or single Laplacian filter. We can actually use a stack of filters with high dimensional filter bank. And then we can actually randomly initialize them and learn them end to end, just like in standard spatial convolution layers. So we call such a layer with splat and convolutions with several with our high dimensional filter bank, and slice as bilateral convolution layer because it is inspired from bilateral filtering literature. In general, this is a very general sparse high dimensional neural network layer. And we can actually use this bilateral convolution layer as a basic building blocks interleaved with ReLU nonlinearities or dropouts, and then actually make a new type of neural network architecture, which we call bilateral neural network. Any questions so far with the technique? Yeah.
When you split the corner, it causes artifacts. What do those artifacts look like?
It is like a discretizing the space, right? So we are actually discretizing some space. You can think of, like, for example, if you have a 2D lattice. So in 2D lattice also we are kind of discretizing the space because of the camera is actually discretized. So this is, you can think of this like a kind of a low-level sampling, the sampling artifacts kind of thing. Does it answer your question? Yeah. So what are the advantages of these sparse high-dimensional neural networks, or which we call as bilateral neural networks? So there are several interesting advantages of this. So one is the efficient computation. So we actually, in the high dimensions, as I have told you before, using Euclidean lattice is very inefficient. So we make use of more efficient permutohedral lattice to do more efficient convolution in high-dimensional spaces. And also the high-dimensional spaces are quite sparse. So only the few points in the space are populated. So we make use of hash table to do the convolution only at those points where the space is populated. So our technique is in general more efficient compared to doing standard ND convolution using standard neural network architectures. Yeah. And another interesting advantage of our implementation or our sparse high-dimensional network is that we have the separate specification of input feature and lattice features. So the input features defines what is observed at each point in space, and the lattice feature defines where these points are observed. So for example, let's take an example of an image, right? If you have an input feature RGB and the lattice feature XY, so this is actually a standard spatial convolution. So if we use input feature RGB and lattice feature XY RGB, so this is a standard bilateral filtering. Bilateral filtering is a special case of this, and standard spatial convolution is here. So our implementation allows flexible specification of both. For example, we can use any neural network feature or deep feature as input feature, and the lattice feature can be XY RGB or XY depth if you have depth information, or just RGB. So we can actually project the data into whatever dimension, whatever space we want, and then do the convolution there. So it's quite flexible. And also we can easily specify the receptive field of a network, just like in standard CNNs, by changing the lattice scale. If we use XY RGB and if we use half 0.5 times XY RGB, we can get bigger lattice scales. By just changing the scale of the features, we can change the receptive fields of the filter. Another interesting advantage, actually, I would say the side effect of our implementation, but which we found to be quite useful, is that we don't need to splat and slice at the same set of points. So we can actually splat at certain set of points, but slice at a different set of points. I mean, we can actually splat the points from certain points in a given image, but slice at a different set of points. I will actually make use of these in experiments. Like we found this property quite useful. This helps in propagating information from one image to another image, or propagating information from one part of the image to other part of the image. So those are the main advantages of bilateral neural networks. And any questions in this? Yeah. So we found that these bilateral neural networks have a wide range of applications in computer vision. We found applications in 2D, 3D, and video analysis. So in this talk, I will cover 3 applications. One is joint image filtering. Second one is video information propagation. And the third one is 3D point cloud segmentation. Application 1, joint image filtering. So here the task is to enhance an input with the help of a given guidance image. So let's say one example is color upsampling. Let's say we are given a low resolution color image, and we have this high resolution guidance image, which is a grayscale image. So how can we make use of this high resolution guidance to upsample this low resolution image? So to get an upsampled image like this. So we can use our bilateral convolution layer to do this in this following way. So we can use this high resolution guidance image to actually get a XY intensity space. So we can actually discretize this XY intensity space using permutohedral lattice. And we actually splat these points from the low resolution image onto this 3-dimensional space. And we can do the convolution with our learnable filter, and then but slice at the high resolution points that we are interested in. So this way we can enhance or upsample a given image by using a guidance image. So we train our filter on these Pascal VOC images, and these is sample result. Yep. So here is a low resolution color input, and this is a high resolution grayscale guidance. And this is a ground truth color image, and this is a bilinear upsample image. Sorry, I think it's cut actually. Things. And this is our result with our learned filter in this 3-dimensional space. And this is this is the result with the using Gaussian filter in 3-dimensional space, and this is with the learned filter in the 3-dimensional space. As you can see, we can preserve better information. And also in terms of PSNR, we get better if we actually learn the filter in high-dimensional space instead of using a Gaussian filter. So this is we also experimented with depth upsampling. So CNN depth estimation results are often low resolution, but we have high resolution RGB image. So can we use the input image, high resolution input image, to upsample the low resolution depth? So we can also use our same filter to upsample depth by making use of high resolution RGB. So this is the upsampling result with Gaussian filter in high dimensional space. So here we are actually doing the filter in XY RGB space, 5-dimensional space. And this is the Laurent filter using the Laurent filter, and this is the ground truth. And also here in terms of number, by using the Laurent filter, we get performance improvements instead of using standard Gaussian filter. And the second application is the video information propagation. Here the task is, given a video, how can we propagate information across video frames? For example, given a video and given a mask for the first frame, can we propagate that mask, object mask, to the remaining video frames? Another example is the color propagation. For example, given a grayscale video and first frame is colored, how can we propagate this color to the other video frames? So again, there are several challenges in video propagation because of dense pixel associations across frames, because of scene motion and camera motion. And also, since there are many frames in a video, it is difficult to process the entire video frames using standard CNN filters. So these challenges complicate the use of CNNs with fixed sizes. And so we also found that our layer with this bilateral convolution layer, with this high dimensional layer, is also found to be quite useful for this video propagation. So this is how we use our layer here. So we first construct a lattice in the 6-dimensional space, XY RGB time space. So this is a 6-dimensional grid. And we project the previous frame masks onto this 6-dimensional grid with the lattice features coming from previous frame RGB. And once we project onto this 6-dimensional space, so we do the standard convolution here, but we slice back onto the present frame. So this is how we propagate information from previous frames onto the present frame. But we don't need to use a single filter. So we construct a new neural network architecture, which we call video propagation networks, which is composed of 2 networks. One is bilateral networks, and the second one is spatial networks. So the bilateral network is composed of several of our BCL, the sparse high dimensional layers, which propagates information from previous frames to the present frame. And this is followed by a spatial network, which is composed of a series of convolution layers, which further predicts the mask for the present frame. So we experimented with this data set called Davis, which comes with very good annotations for object masks. So here the task is that given the object mask for the first frame, can we propagate it to the rest of the frames? So here is the one sample result obtained with our video propagation network. So top left shows the original video, top right shows the ground truth, bottom left shows one of the state-of-the-art techniques at that time, 2 years ago, and top right is our technique. As you can see, we can propagate better compared to BVS, which is on the top left. Yeah. So this is another sample result of our technique. And we also used our VPN for propagating color information. Given a grayscale video shown on the top left, and for the color for the first frame, how can we propagate it to the rest of the video frames? So here is one of the popular techniques, the Levin et al. As you can see, we can propagate color much better compared to Levin et al. And this is another color propagation result. So the third application is a 3D point cloud segmentation. So here the task is to create an end-to-end trainable networks for analyzing point cloud information. And a sample application could be the semantic segmentation of point clouds. For example, given a point cloud like this, can we say which of the points belongs to wall, which of them are door or shop or balcony? So there are several challenges in working with point clouds because point clouds are unordered and sparse, and there is no really defined connections between the points. So this makes the use of standard CNNs very challenging to process point cloud information. So we found that our general sparse high-dimensional network, since actually the data is sparse, since we can deal with sparse data with our bilateral convolution layer, so we found that we can easily process point clouds with our layer. So we create a new neural network architecture which we call SplatNet, using our bilateral convolution layers. That this works like this. First we pass point cloud through a 1-by-1 convolution, and then we pass it through a series of bilateral convolution layers with an increasing receptive field size, and we pull the information. And we pull the information from all these BCL layers and then pass through a couple of more convolution layers to actually get a semantic segmentation of point clouds. So oftentimes we also have a 2D data coupled with a 3D data. Like if we have a LiDAR scan or on the autonomous driving, we have both 2D images and also the LiDAR scans. Also here we may have a 2D images coupled with 3D facade data sets. So how can we make use of both 2D and 3D data to do semantic segmentation? So we use a variation of our bilateral convolution layers to achieve this. So we call this BCL 2D to 3D and BCL 3D to 2D, which I will briefly explain how they work. So assuming for each 2D pixel we know the corresponding 3D point. So we know for each XY position we know the corresponding XYZ. So what we do is that we actually make the lattice in XYZ space, and we splat the pixels from 2D onto these XYZ space, but slice from the points of interest in the 3D point cloud. So this way we can propagate information from 2D, smoothly project information from 2D onto 3D. So we call this BCL 2D to 3D, and we can also do other way around. We can go back from 3D point cloud onto the 2D features. We call this BCL 3D to 2D. So with these variations of BCL, we can smoothly project between 2D and 3D. So by making use of these BCL variants and by making use of 2D CNNs, we actually create a new neural network architecture which we call SplatNet 2D 3D that can process both 3D point cloud and input images and produce 3D predictions and 2D predictions for semantic segmentations. So in summary, we actually create two types of architectures. One is SplatNet 3D that does 3D segmentation, and SplatNet 2D 3D that does both 2D and 3D segmentation. We experiment on several data sets. One is facade segmentation. Here the task is given the scene like this, the predict semantics for points, and this is the result of our SplatNet 3D network. And in terms of numbers, we got state-of-the-art numbers compared to existing techniques using SplatNet 3D. And by making use of both 2D and 3D data, we get further improvements in IOU, which is from 65 to 69. And what we observed that by we can also improve 2D predictions as well by using our SplatNet 2D 3D because we are making use of 3D data. So by just using 2D CNN, we get 69.3 IOU. And by making use of both 2D and 3D data, we get 70.6. So here are our sample predictions on the ground truth. And we also experiment on 3D object part labeling dataset on ShapeNet. So here the task is that given a point cloud, we have to label which part the point belongs to, whether it belongs to the body or wheels or something like this, yeah. For chair, whether it belongs to legs or seat or back. Also on this data set, we obtain on-par results with state-of-the-art using SplatNet 3D by making use of only 3D data. And by making use of both 2D and 3D data, we surpass state-of-the-art results. This is last year, yeah, at that time. So for these 3D point cloud segmentations, we also experimented with going to higher dimensions, like going to XYZ normal space, doing 6-dimensional space. With this, we get only marginal improvements in performance. So in summary, I have presented a general sparse high-dimensional neural network, which we also call bilateral neural networks, which has several advantages over standard CNNs when we are dealing with high-dimensional spaces. One is that we can get efficient computation with permutohedral lattice and hash tables. And we can do a flexible specification of lattice features and also the size of the filters. And also another interesting side advantage is that the input and output points can be at different points. This is very useful in actually propagating information, let's say from previous frames to present frame or from 2D to 3D. So it has wide range of applications in 2D video and 3D vision. And all the codes are publicly available. You can get the links in my website. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, and any sessions are welcome. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
So as the dimensionality goes up, things become more and more sparse, right?
Yeah.
And in general, when things become more sparse, I guess perhaps maybe it doesn't generalize as well. Is there like a limit as to like how sparse it should be or how many dimensions?
Yeah. I don't know the exact answer for that, but intuitively, we need enough data so that the data won't get too sparse. Because if you have only one point in these lattice structures, like probably if you have only one point in 6-dimensional simplex, if you actually project it onto all the corner points, the data is just not enough. Like,
You might have more corners than data points.
yeah, you may have more corners and data points, so it is not enough. So we need at least some kind of dense data in high dimensions. So there is some limit.
It's almost like arguing model complexity, right? Do you have a really, really complex one or a really simple one?
Yeah. So I don't have clear exact answer like how much data we want for how many dimensions. But as we go more and more higher dimensions, the need for data samples also gets higher. Yeah.
Thanks, Varun.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you, kind of in terms of future directions, like if you had the resources and team, what kind of things would you apply these networks on, and what kind of extensions would you work on for these kind of problems?
Things. So one of the disadvantages now is that we need to manually specify these feature dimensions, right? So we need to manually specify which feature space is good enough for this data, right? Is this XY RGB, or is it XY depth, or XYZ normals, or some other feature space? So that is one of the drawbacks of this approach, but it is very difficult problem. So one of the ideal cases in future direction would be to actually also learn these feature spaces. So which feature spaces we want to project our data to process there. That is actually a very interesting problem. So this is like learning a sampling in 2D space, like which space to go to, kind of thing.
Is that the same as learning a coordinate access system, or is it distinct from that?
Is it same as what?
Same as learning like the coordinate access system that you want? Or
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is kind of learning what is a coordinate access that we want to learn with. So in most of the CNN, we actually take it granted that we work with XY lattice, right? It is just because the camera is giving us XY lattice, but it need not be the optimal lattice space. So what is an optimal space to learn is also a good, interesting problem, actually. Yeah. So any other questions? Yep. Thanks for the attention, and yeah.